A teenager in love, Marty Wilde. My rival that I'm still friends with 65 years later. I may have released the first British rock and roll single in the autumn of 1958, but I certainly wasn't the only British rock and roll singer. No, the rise of Elvis and the American rockers had given birth to loads of British artists who were as driven as me to emulate the sounds and the attitudes beaming across the Atlantic. When the Drifters and I started going on Jack Good's Oh Boy, we found ourselves in the midst of a whole heap of young British rock and roll singers. They became both our friends and our competitors, our rivals for valuable TV airtime, chart positions, and foremost among them from the off was Marty Wilde. Marty was a year older than me and a little bit ahead of me. He'd released his first single, Honeycomb, with his band The Wildcats in 1957, then two more in the first half of 1958. None of them had been hits, but it was a different story in June 1958 when he released Endless Sleep. Endless Sleep was a cover of a recent U.S. hit by an American rockabilly singer called Jody Reynolds. It was a big, lush, romantic song with a sad but ambiguous lyric. Was the singer's girl dead? Had she drowned? And a twangy guitar. I liked it, and it shot up the UK hit parade and into the top 5. This meant that Marty Wilde was more established than me when I joined Oh Boy, and he headlined early shows over me. But Move It went down well on my first appearance, and as it became a hit, Jack Good began to alternate Marty and me as the program headliners. One week Marty, the next week me. Marty Wilde, thus, immediately became my rival. But, luckily, there was no edge to that rivalry. Off camera, our relationship was fine. We would hang out in our dressing rooms, talking about our favorite American stars, comparing thoughts on their latest songs. He was a cool guy. Jack would sometimes get artists to sing together. One week, he told Marty and me, plus another Brit rock and roller, Dickie Pride, to do a number together. The Coasters, Three Cool Cats. We lined up in front of the camera and harmonized sweetly through that neat Lieber and Stoller song. It seemed to go well, but when I saw the recording years later, I was horrified. Oh no, why did they let me on TV looking like that? Marty looked like an absolute cool cat, as he always did, and Dickie Pride looked fine. But I looked like an utter slob, a greaseball. Jack Good was happy with it, but I hated it when I saw it. Marty and I ticked along quite nicely, alternating the weekly headline slots on Oh Boy. I have to admit that I enjoyed the shows most when the Drifters and I topped the bill. And then, suddenly, we were doing that nearly every week because Marty vanished off the program. And it was all down to his manager. Marty was managed by a man called Larry Parnes, a maverick and influential figure in early British rock and roll. He was an extremely driven young London entrepreneur with a reputation for being very money-motivated. In fact, I can remember the newspapers used to call him Mr. Parnes Shillings and Pence. Parnes was still only in his late 20s when we did Oh Boy, but he had already amassed an impressive stable of young rock and rollers. He would sometimes drop in on a rehearsal to check that his acts were all okay. I must admit, some weeks he seemed to be managing everybody on the show except for me. Parnes had started off managing Tommy Steele, then signed up a young guy called, wait for it, Reg Patterson. Well, let's face it, Reg Patterson is an even more rubbish name for a rock and roller than Harry Webb, so Parnes quickly renamed him Marty Wilde. Larry told Jack he had to scale down my appearances and focus more on his man Marty. Well, Jack Good wasn't having that. As I'd learned firsthand, Jack was a genius control freak. Oh Boy was his baby, and he wasn't going to take any interference from lippy artist managers. He told Larry Parnes either to mind his own business or sling his hook, and Parnes did the latter. He pulled Marty Wilde off the show. The row was a load of nonsense over nothing, really, but it certainly benefited Cliff Richard and the Drifters because we got a lot more top billings while Marty wasn't around. And next time I saw Marty, he was as friendly as ever. There were no hard feelings. Why should there be? It had all been nothing to do with us. That summer, he reached number 2 with the song that I have chosen for this book, A Teenager in Love. Like most of Marty's hits, A Teenager in Love was a cover, in this case, of a recent U.S. hit by a New York doo-wop rock and roll band, Dion and the Belmonts. Well, let me tell you, the Drifters and I loved Dion and the Belmonts. We had listened avidly to such previous hits as I Wonder Why and No One Knows on AFN. Dion and the Belmonts had such beautiful harmonies, and if I'm honest, I maybe liked that original version of Teenager in Love slightly more than I did Marty's cover. But Marty's version was tremendous as well. When it got to number 2 in the charts, I thought that it deserved it. Of course, Marty Wilde wasn't the only British rock and roller the Drifters and I met on Oh Boy. For a year, it was the main television platform for music stars, and every record company and manager going was desperate to get their artist on the show. It gave me a chance to have a good close look at our competitors. He had further hits in 1959, such as Sea of Love, which I thought was a great song, but then his record sales hit a slump as we moved into the 60s. He had one last top 10 hurrah in 1961 with Rubber Ball, and then that was pretty much it, charts-wise, for Marty. That seems bizarre to me. When I look back at me singing Move It and Marty singing Endless Sleep, I think Marty was a far more mature singer than me. He seemed to be comfortable with his voice from the off, whereas it took me ages to find my best singing voice. It took me years to let go, to free myself.